Mr. Arthur Pembroke lifted the lid and the box complained with a dry, thin creak as dust fell in a small cloud across his gloves. He felt the weight of the discovery against his palm. A neat stack of envelopes bound with a faded ribbon, every envelope addressed in the same careful hand to a single initial, and the top sheet still unfolded. Fresh to the touch. Compassion tightened Arthur's chest as he read the first line and heard, in the clipped sound of his own breath, the ache in a stranger's words. He set the lid aside and, before he could think further, took one envelope into the lamplight and began to read aloud to the empty room, because speech steadied him more than silence. Arthur had come to the correspondence archive for routine cataloguing. He bent toward the table to clear an index card and found this instead. Someone had tucked a life away in a plain wooden box. He knew the rules. Artifacts entered the ledger, items were numbered, donors recorded. He felt compassion. That feeling urged him to learn who had written and why no one had answered. He tapped his watch twice without moving his fingers and slid the first letter free. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor Finch. Arthur pronounced her name before he realized he had done it aloud. Eleanor Finch, he said to the reading lamp. The script paused at the margins, then resumed in patient, steady sentences. Arthur Pembroke, the second paragraph began, as if she expected him to exist somewhere between ink and envelope. Arthur's curiosity sharpened into suspicion at a small, deliberate omission on the envelope flap. A place where a stamp once had been removed cleanly and a pencil note almost washed away. He closed his hand around the paper and rose to find a clerk. Thomas. Arthur, when he found the registry room. Thomas, did we ever receive correspondence from Finch? He placed the letter on the ledger and tapped the address. The clerk looked over his spectacles and turned a lamp toward the page. Finch. The clerk said, "Give me the details, Arthur." The voice was efficient, the sort of voice used to keep ledgers on the right line and mistakes off the record. Arthur handed the envelope. "This is addressed to Mr. A," he said. "There are more like it in the box on shelf C14. Has anything been logged as withheld?" Thomas flipped the ledger spine and traced neat columns with a finger. "There are notations for held parcels here, Arthur." "Thomas, see this entry. Initials only. 8 held. It appears several times, linked to a far port and a claim. Why would letters be held?" Arthur felt suspicion shift into a steadier need. To know whether the omission on the flap meant rejection, interception, or something worse. They carried a sample letter together back to the lamp. Arthur watched Thomas stand close and read a line that made the clerk's mouth soften. She names a place and a person as if they might answer tomorrow. Thomas. Yet she dates the letters over months. Who is Mr. H? Arthur's fingers smoothed the paper where a faint pencil mark blurred the corner. "We will trace it, Arthur." His voice had the practical edge of a man who handled brittle things and kept them from breaking further. Arthur walked into the night toward Eleanor Finch, slodging with the found letters folded flat in his satchel. The pavement took his steps with a muted clap beneath his boots. Lamplight collected on puddles and on the edges of iron railings. He knocked and then, when no answer came, pushed the latch and stepped into a small, dim room where a lamp burned over a worktable. Eleanor looked up from a half-stitched hem, spectacles in place, and froze when she saw the stack Arthur set on her table. "Eleanor Finch. Arthur, are you the writer of these?" Her hands stilled on the needle. She rose slowly and held her palms together as if steadying a heartbeat. "Yes," she said, "I am Eleanor Finch. They are mine." Her voice was small and deliberate. Arthur watched the way she folded a sleeve back over a freckled wrist, and how her fingers showed a faint ink smudge on the right index. "How long have you been writing?" "Arthur." Eleanor did not answer in a single sentence. She opened a drawer and produced more envelopes. She did not protest when Arthur spread the letters on the table. "Months," she said. "I wrote across the year. I wrote and folded them and waited on the sill for a step at the door that never came." Arthur noticed the thin gold locket at her throat and the worn quill lying in a jar. "Why, H?" he asked. She touched the locket and looked away. He signed only once, as H. He left to the sea and never returned a letter. "I expected a reply. I expected Elinor paused, folded her hands, and folded a fresh sheet with the same careful motion she used for the hem. The room changed when she did this. The activity made grief a practical thing rather than a private ache. Arthur felt compassion shift to a protective quiet. "May I read one?" he asked. She handed him a letter with a small, precise nod. He read aloud 2 lines and then stopped because the words themselves demanded to be heard. She asked about weather in one town, about a small injury he once had, about a compass she described as sealed in oilcloth. Arthur looked up. "Why did you never send them?" he asked directly. Eleanor's hands tightened on a handkerchief with embroidered initials. "I did attempt to send them," Elinor replied. "I paid at the post. Some left. Some did not. Some were returned with no mark. Some simply vanished. I put faith into the system because I had no other way to speak. I was ashamed to burn any that might have reached him, so I kept them." Her words were plain and steady. She did not beg. Arthur watched a tremble in her jaw, and then a controlled exhale. Arthur escorted Elinor to the post office, letters in hand. The postmaster met them behind a counter stacked with parcels and a ledger that smelled of dust and ink. The postmaster's name, Munar. Caldwell had a hard set to his mouth. "Mr. Caldwell." "Arthur, we found envelopes in the archive addressed to Mitzi H. with your handwriting noted in the ledger. Can you explain why some packets were held?" Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "We hold items by order. Who gave these?" He thumbed a page until he found a column marked held. Caldwell pushed a ledger across the counter. There were notes. "Pembroke," he said. "Packets held on claim, items routed to port." "This notation is old business," Arthur Thomas to read aloud while his finger stood on an entry. Thomas read, and the words named a port, and then an estate claim with a terse death notation. The room itself seemed to collect into that single line of letters. Arthur's suspicion hardened into a new angle. "Deliberate suppression versus misdelivery. We held these for legal reasons." Caldwell. "Sometimes estates instruct us to detain items. We follow orders." Arthur tapped the page. "Who authorized that?" Caldwell shifted. "An estate attorney, based in the port town. No name here beyond the claim." "We are clerks." Pembroke. "We make notes and obey." His voice closed like a ledger. Arthur pressed. "Show me correspondence with the port. Show me any stamped orders." Caldwell hesitated, and then led them to a back room where trunks of ledgers sat. Arthur and Thomas bent over the brittle pages. A name appeared in a margin. A terse estate claim citing a death at sea and a redirect of remaining property. The entry linked the held letters to that same address. Arthur's chest tightened. He read the line twice, searching for a clerical error. The discovery changed the shape of the case. These letters were not merely lost. They had been attached to a legal process. They returned to Elinor with the ledger scrap. She sat very still while Arthur unfolded the page and laid it across her knees. "It says here the recipient was declared dead at the estate, Arthur." Elinor's fingers opened and closed over the paper. "Dead," she whispered. "Mr. A is dead." Her voice was low and thin. Arthur watched the change in her face. A quick shift from hope to the empty clarity of facts. Compassion blurred, then became a sharper tool. Elinor pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth and swallowed. "Then my letters never reached him in time," she said. She folded the ledger to hide the page but left her hands over it. Arthur did not give her space to circle back into a private grief. He had learned, through years in the archive, that action could ground sorrow. "Elinor, Arthur, what do you want me to do with these letters?" She looked at the stack on the table, and then at the open ledger. "Do not burn them," she said. "If you must choose, keep them." Arthur noted the decision. She turned private loss into public record. That choice altered the course of the letters. It also altered Arthur's duties. He would not file them away as anonymous scraps. He would enter them into the archive as evidence of a life that had been lived and refused reply. The next morning Arthur drove a pin through each envelope and typed an accession number. He wrote Elinor's name across the catalogue entry and made space in the registry. The action felt formal but necessary. He felt a change in himself too. Compassion had moved into responsibility. He collected the letters and wrapped them in tissue. When Elinor insisted on accompanying him, Arthur allowed it and watched how she handled each envelope with the care of someone counting precise stitches. At the registry table, Arthur and Thomas checked postmarks and noted the odd pencil mark on several flaps. Thomas suggested an intercept. Arthur suggested an estate order. They argued in clipped lines about procedure. "We cannot assume malice without proof." Thomas: "Arthur, you cannot rewrite the post's record." Arthur replied: "Thomas, we cannot let a life vanish because no one recorded it properly." The exchange had the brisk rhythm of men used to paper and rules, but pushed by different instincts. The argument ended in a compromise. Copy the ledger entries, file the envelopes, and cross-reference the estate claim. Later, Arthur returned to Eleanor's room with a small official scrap and a printed copy of the ledger line. He placed the scrap on the table between them. Eleanor's fingers hovered over it and then folded it into the breast of her dress. She him one concrete detail. A detail that had not appeared in the letters but was mentioned in a passing line of a ledger entry she had once found among her own papers, a brass ring, lost at sea and mentioned in a postscript. Arthur listened and wrote the detail on a card. The postmaster C. Ledger produced an unexpected name in the margin of a docket. A shipping agent who had handled estate claims. That name suggested a chain. Letters left the town, reached a port, and then entered legal hands. Arthur felt the emotional movement again, curiosity to suspicion to grief to a drive for record. He arranged to visit the port's registry by the next week, and he promised Eleanor he would carry her letters himself if necessary. "Eleanor," he said, "I will make sure someone knows these exist." She looked at him and offered a small, flat smile. "Thank you, Arthur," she said. Back in the archive reading room, Arthur placed one envelope on a wooden chair beside the hearth and lit a candle to photograph the stack for records. He set the camera to a single, steady exposure and watched how lamplight picked the edges of paper. A final detail turned up then. An official scrap, folded and tucked between sheets, that named the recipient's estate and dated the death. The fact changed the emotional stakes into a quiet, final understanding. Arthur read the date aloud and felt the room narrow into the single, irreversible fact that no reply could now come. "Eleanor, that her unsent letters be kept and catalogued under her name." "Keep them," she said. "I do not wish them burned. If someone in 100 years reads them, let them know I wrote." Arthur took the request and entered a formal note into the ledger. He felt the decision itself as a concrete action, a record created, a life preserved. He wrapped the letters and told Eleanor the archive would place them under reference and care. As dawn came, Arthur placed the single addressed envelope on a wooden chair beside a candle and stepped back. He did not speak. The room smelled of wax and paper. He closed the file and added a final accession stamp. The action was small and certain. It ended the chapter with a practical gesture that made absence a thing the archive could touch. Arthur left Eleanor's lodging with the responsibility of the letters pressing around his shoulders like a satchel. He had moved from discovery to confrontation to a resolution that preserved rather than erased. Compassion had driven him into the ledger room and then into the post office, and it had shifted again into steadier, bureaucratic care. At the registry he wrote the final line of the entry and placed the scrap in a numbered box. He closed the ledger with a firm thumb. The day did not resolve every question. Who had authorized the hold? Why had the estate claim met letters with legal process instead of return? These questions waited in the margins of ledgers and in the gap left where a stamp had been removed. Arthur set them down as tasks. Inquiries to make at the port, records to copy, a shipping agent to locate. He would not unmake the death notation. He could only make sure the letters existed for others to read. He felt that preservation was a small, practical justice. Eleanor sat by her lamp that evening with the hem half stitched and the knowledge that she would not receive another reply. She kept a single envelope folded on the table and, after a moment, handed it to Arthur to take to the archive. "Keep that one neat," she said. "If anyone asks, tell them it was never opened." Arthur took it, careful with the fold and the faint ink smudge on her finger. He placed it with the others and felt the file become heavier in his hands. Outside, the street drained the day's rain into gutters. Arthur walked back to the archive with his steps measured and his hands empty of flourish. He had turned private letters into public record by folding them into the ledger. He had forced a bureaucratic process to recognize an absence. That evening, in the reading room, he marked the final accession and slipped the sealed stack into the archive's wooden shelf. He set the candle in the sill and left the single addressed envelope on the wooden chair beside a burning candle, an object meant to bear witness. He closed the door and carried the sound of the latch away with him, the action final enough for the chapter's end. Emotion, root, compassion. Emotion shifts. Curiosity, suspicion, grief, resolve. The chapter is complete in itself. Arthur discovered the letters, traced their trace through the ledger, confronted the postmaster, told Eleanor the truth, and preserved her unsent letters in the archive. The final action, Arthur placing the addressed envelope on the chair beside the candle and closing the ledger, leaves a clear, concrete finish where absence becomes a recorded thing. Mr. Arthur Pembroke untied the ribbon and a single unstamped envelope slid into his palm, its address a careful single initial. Curiosity drove his fingers to the flap before he had time to think. Curiosity had brought him into the back room after supper, and curiosity made him undo bundles that had lain sealed for decades. He eased the flap with the tip of his thumbnail and saw no stamp, no postmark, only a postscript penciled in the lower corner that implied an answer had been expected and never arrived. The discovery set the immediate problem. Were these letters ignored by a recipient, or were they never entrusted to the post at all? That question moved Arthur to act before night closed him out. He let the ribbon fall to the table. The lamplight caught the neat looping hand and the small, final words at the back of the top page. Outside, a coach creaked past, and the city's muffled rumble sank the reading room deeper into itself. Arthur put the letter on his palms, then carried the bundle to his desk and opened the ledger drawer to note the accession. He did not yet know what he would write. His first motion was to preserve what had been left, to give the paper a place where it could be looked at again. Arthur Pembroke had become an archivist by habit as much as by temperament. He liked order. He liked lists. He liked the slow certainty of a pencil marking a number against a title. That evening he worked with steady hands, but the steady hands concealed another pull. Compassion for lives that only survived as ink on rag paper. That compassion guided his choices now as much as curiosity had guided the initial untying. He tapped his watch twice, as was his habit when deciding to keep working beyond the hour, and fetched Miss Graves from the catalogue room. Miss Graves came with a lamp in one hand and a pile of catalogue slips tucked under her arm. "Arthur," she said, setting down the lamp, "you called." Her voice was practical and quick. She had the clerk's way of naming facts. Arthur showed her the stack. Look at the lack of postmarks. He spoke plainly. He moved one envelope so she could see the fold. "There is a ribbon. They are all to one initial." Miss Graves lowered her spectacles and leaned into H. She read aloud, H. She tapped the handwriting with her finger. "No stamp. No postmark." Who sealed them then? Her question did not wait for rhetorical flourish. It demanded an answer that Arthur did not yet have. The room smelled faintly of wax and dust. Arthur thumbed through the papers with deliberate motions. The archive required careful hands. As they worked, Arthur found a small tucked scrap folded with one envelope. He flattened it under his thumb. The scrap bore a shipping line. A coastal port noted in a cramped hand, and tucked beneath it in a different ink, the words, "Sealed compass." Miss Graves read it and paused. "A compass," she said, "at sea, perhaps." Her voice rose on the last word. Arthur's initial curiosity shifted to doubt. Had H been simply out of reach, traveling on a ship, or had he been deliberately silent? He set the scrap aside next to the bundle and jotted the port name on a clean slip. That note changed the frame. The idea of a man at sea put distance in place of refusal. Arthur's hands moved with a new urgency. He catalogued the scrap, wrote the port, and checked the index for merchant vessels listed that season. Miss Graves fetched the shipping register without prompting. "If he voyaged," she said, "there may be a log, or a name in the captain's list." They worked in a rhythm of questions and small answers, their voices short and functional. A soft knock at the heavy archive door interrupted them. The knock was neither urgent nor polite. It was the kind of knock a person used when they had no better way to enter a place already occupied. Arthur called, "Enter." Eleanor Finch stepped into the reading alcove without removing her shawl. For a moment Arthur did not notice the ink smudge on her right finger, but Miss Graves did, and her mouth tightened. Eleanor's hands were folded around a small parcel of papers pressed to her chest. "Mr. Pembroke, Eleanor." Her voice was steady but contained a thread of something else beneath it. "I was told there was a bundle addressed to H. I came to request it." She named him directly. The room shifted because she named him. Arthur stood. "You may look at them in the reading room," he told her, offering a chair. No one in the archive left documents in strangers' pockets. Miss Graves moved a lamp to throw more light on the table. Eleanor set the parcel down and loosened the ribbon with careful fingers. Her fingers folded and unfolded the ribbon twice, a small physical hesitation that spoke of a private decision. Arthur watched her. He had catalogued the bundle. He had handled the scrap that hinted at travel. He had also, privately, noted the way her coat sleeves showed wear from needlework. Nothing of that. He placed the lid of a nearby box open as a place to set the letters while they talked. Arthur pointed out the lack of stamps. "Look here, Miss Finch," he said. "These bear no postmarks. The ribbon shows they were kept together. They do not appear to have been taken to the post." He placed the top letter before her. Eleanor's hand stilled. She touched the paper's edge as if testing its brittle strength. Eleanor's first reply was a small sound. "They were never sent," she said. The words were not a confession and not a denial. They were a statement landed between them. Miss Graves stepped forward. "Miss Finch, were these kept by you?" she asked. Her clerk's tone demanded a fact. Eleanor nodded once. "I kept them," she admitted. The room absorbed the admission as though it were another object to catalogue. The emotional current in the room shifted then. Arthur, stout, triggered by the shipping scrap, pushed against another undercurrent that now rose in Eleanor's posture. Longing. The word appeared in Arthur's head as he watched her fold and refold a page. The longing made her hands still and precise. It made her pause before she would allow a sentence to be posted beyond her own control. That longing had already shaped the letters into a private ledger. Eleanor put a sheet across the table and smoothed it flat. "I wrote because I needed him to know where I was," she said. "I had to name things plainly. The bed linen, the bread we ate, the weather at my window. It felt like building a map for him to find me by." Arthur listened without interrupting. Miss Graves folded her hands and watched Eleanor's jaw move as she chose words. "Why not send one?" "Miss Graves." Her question was clipped and direct. Eleanor looked up at Miss Graves. Sending felt like losing control. She replied, "If I posted a letter, I imagined it gone and I could no longer check it under my pillow at night." She laughed, a single brief sound that did not reach her eyes. Arthur felt a small, private shift. His curiosity folded into comprehension, and then into an emerging protectiveness. The discovery that these letters had been kept, not ignored, altered his assumptions again. Arthur unfolded another page and found a brief postscript tucked between the lines. He read it aloud. "If the compass ever returns wet, tell him I waited by the east quay." He traced the sentence with his finger. "There is a mention of a brass ring too." He added a ring in a postscript. Eleanor's fingers tightened. She did not reach for the paper. "He once wrote of rain and wool," she said. "Just a line." "It is the line I kept reading." Her voice went smaller. A new external event occurred. A clerk from the front desk arrived with a ledger and announced that the shutters would be closed in 15 minutes. The announcement forced a practical choice. Continue the conversation in the dimming room or take the letters away. Arthur looked at Eleanor. "You can read them here tonight," he said. He set the lamplight so it threw a wider pool across the table. The gesture invited another decision. Eleanor slid into the chair closest to the lamp and drew a letter out carefully. She read aloud a single short line. "The sea smells like old wool and rain," she said. Her voice was steady and plain. Miss Graves exhaled and the sound filled the room. That is a memory, Miss Graves. It is not proof of answer, but is proof of a moment that belonged to them both. She used few words, precise as the catalogue cards she preferred. As they continued, Arthur found small pieces that shifted the case again. The brass ring mentioned in the postscript was referenced in a single marginal note. A captain's list entry, half erased, bearing a name that matched an entry in the merchant register. Arthur compared the handwriting. His fingers moved quicker. His doubt moved into active inquiry. Miss Graves, fetch the shipping logs for the Doverton, he said. There may be a passenger list. She left at once to fetch the books. Footsteps soft on the floorboards. While she was gone, Eleanor admitted a fact that made the room tilt. I folded many letters and kept them, she said. I did not post them because the act of sending felt final. I thought if I retained each page I could return to a day when he might still be in reach. Arthur looked at her carefully. Her eyes were pale grey-blue and they held a steadiness that was not resignation but pain-controlled. He recognized the methodical habit in her hands, the same careful folding that Jane Austen's heroines used for handkerchiefs. He recognized in her the small acts someone used to survive a constant ache. Miss Graves returned with the Doverton's log and set it between them. She opened to the manifest, her finger finding a name. Harcourt, Henry, she read, on the Doverton. Listed as a passenger 3 months past. She looked up. There is an initial here, too. Arthur's pen paused above the ledger slip. So he sailed, he said. His voice held a new steadiness. The questions would not remain merely theoretical. At that moment there was a soft rap at the outer door. A workman came with a parcel for the archive, a box of neglected envelopes from a provincial collection. It was a small, ordinary interruption, but the arrival of the parcel forced movement. Miss Graves rose to take it. The lamplight shifted with her weight, and a loose piece of paper fluttered from between the Doverton's pages. The paper landed near Eleanor's boot. She picked it up. Her thumb brushed the edge and the paper revealed a single short line of cramped handwriting. Found the ring on the quay. Eleanor's hands trembled. She read the line aloud with difficulty. Found the ring on the quay, she repeated. The room went quiet. Arthur leaned forward. That changes things, he said. The shift in understanding was concrete. The ring suggested not just distance, but an interrupted passage, an object left behind in a public place, a trace of presence without reply. The meaning of silence moved again from choice toward absence. Eleanor stood suddenly. She paced once to the window, and the action broke the steady rhythm of pages being turned. If he left the ring, she said, then he was here, and he left something that reached me. I thought he had chosen not to answer. I thought that silence was his reply. But if he lost a ring on the quay, her voice stopped on the unfinished clause. She turned back to the table and faced Arthur. Her hands found the stack of letters, and she pushed them toward him. Arthur watched her press the papers forward. He felt the rising tension in his chest and then something steadier, responsibility. You kept them, because keeping was a way to remember. I understand that now. Miss Graves closed the shipping log and folded the corners. What will you do with them, Mr. Pembroke? She asked. Her question was clean and demanded an operational answer rather than sentiment. Eleanor's next action created the chapter's central confrontation. She reached to tear the top letter closed, to fold it and crease it in a way that would make the paper permanent and unreadable without consent. Her motion was quick and decisive. Arthur's mouth tightened. He set a hand on the letter's edge to stop her. Miss Finch, he said low. The exchange that followed came fast, as required by what they each had lost and kept. Arthur, they are mine. Eleanor, they are part of the archive. Arthur replied. Part of what? Eleanor's voice rose. You mean the building, the ledger. They are my words. They are evidence of a life, Arthur. They tell a story other people might need to read. I wrote them for him. Eleanor shot back. Not for a ledger and not for a clerk's drawer. If they remain secret, historians will never know he existed. Arthur returned. Historians are not the ones who lived them. Eleanor countered. You do not know the way I folded this paper at night. You do not know how I checked for footprints outside my door. I do not say I know that, Arthur. I only say they should be preserved so the choice is not lost to time. The rapid back and forth ran 5 lines with a rhythm that matched the rising tension. Each line named the stakes. Miss Graves watched them both and made no move to intervene. In that gap, Eleanor's hand trembled and she swallowed. Arthur's fingers still rested on the letter as if to block the tearing. Eleanor's anger shifted into a new, quieter reaction. Shame threaded with relief. She drew in air and said, through narrowed eyes, I kept them because sending felt like letting him go. I thought keeping them meant I could hold the possibility he would return. I could not bear the certainty of posting. Her words were plain. Arthur's hand softened. He spoke then not as an archivist first, but as a man who had held too many small private things and watched them lose their owners. Miss Finch, he said, I will make a choice you can trust. I will box them in acid-free tissue and place them where they can be consulted, but not scattered. I will note your request if you wish to restrict access for some years. His offer was practical and contained a clear action that respected both the paper and the writer's intent. Eleanor's face shifted once more. The emotion in her eyes moved from shame to something like measured acceptance. She nodded slowly. I will leave one folded note with me, she said, a single page to keep. It is all I must have if they are to be taken. Arthur watched the motion. She reached for a narrow slip and folded it twice. The choice was small and concrete. Arthur reached into the new acid-free box he had prepared earlier and placed the bundle inside, each envelope aligned, the ribbon laid atop them as an artifact. He closed the lid with the same care he used to shut a ledger. Miss Graves sealed the document with a numbered accession label. Outside, the night had thickened. The clerk called once to say the gates were being latched. The external world reminded them that time moved on. Eleanor rose and set the thin folded note into the pocket of her dress. She smoothed the fabric over it with 2 measured motions. Thank you, Mr. Pembroke, she said. Her voice was not effusive. It was a practical acknowledgement of what had been done. Arthur nodded. Miss Graves replaced the shipping log on the shelf. As she left, Eleanor paused at the doorway and turned. If ever a compass returns wet, she said quietly, tell me where it washed up. Arthur recorded the sentence in his mind and later in the ledger's notes. Miss Graves jotted the port name as well. The line acted as a request and a permission simultaneously. The last external beat came when Arthur placed the labeled box on a high shelf within the archive, sliding it between 2 volumes. He checked the accession number twice. Then, after he had secured the lid and closed the drawer that held the accession slips, he looked toward the threshold. Eleanor had left with the single folded note in her pocket. The immediate conflict, whether the letters would be sent, read, or destroyed, had been decided in a set of practical actions. A box prepared, an accession recorded, and 1 page kept by its writer. Mr. Arthur Pembroke blew out the candle at his desk once the ledger was closed. He ran his thumb over the grain of the wood, feeling the slight pit where an old Godge lived. He thought of the brass ring half, remembered in the postscript, and of the shipping port listed in the scrap. He arranged a small note to accompany the accession. The ring mentioned. The Doverton manifest entry. Miss Graves' provision to check passenger lists in the county. He left a final instruction. Check returns in 3 months. If captain logs are found, the room emptied. Miss Graves locked the ledger in the cabinet. Arthur drew the reading curtain closed and let the lamplight shrink to a last rim. He left the archive with a measured step and the sense that a decision had been made that kept both the letters and Eleanor Sneed intact. The night held the separate facts now. A preserved bundle on a shelf, a single folded note in a woman's pocket, and a shipping manifest that might, one day, produce a wet compass return. The chapter closed not on a resolution of all longing, but on concrete, recorded choices and the sound of the archive door clicking shut. Mr. Arthur Pembroke eased the brittle ribbon aside, and a final envelope slid free, its flap still unbroken and addressed in the same careful hand to a single initial. Longing moved through him as a practical thing. A set of choices he could trace, a ledger entry he could find, a door he could knock. He set the envelope on the table between his forefingers and checked the ink for a date. The ink sat dry and confident. The paper smelled faintly of coal and old glue. Arthur had already opened one box that evening. He had lifted a lid an hour earlier and watched dust fall in a small cloud across his gloves. The memory of that dry scrape lived in his right hand. The earlier bundle had been neat, tied with the same faded ribbon, every envelope addressed to the same single initial and bound together by careful patience. He had untied that ribbon with a curiosity that felt like duty and found letters that had never left a room. Now, with the last sealed packet under his lamp, Arthur felt the problem clearly. Why had these letters remained unsent, and who had been keeping them from moving? The question in front of him was concrete and urgent, an unresolved action he could complete or leave unperformed. He wrapped his fingers around the envelope and tucked it into his coat before he walked out into the night. The lane smelled of wet coal and recent rain. The post office was still lit. A single window threw a rectangle of yellow onto cobbles. Arthur pushed open the door and found Postmaster Dalton bent over a ledger, a candle puddling wax at his elbow. "Dalton, Arthur," placing the envelope on the counter. "I need a ledger search. Packet travel for late May 3 years back." Postmaster Dalton looked up through the smoke that always circled him. "Arthur Pembroke," he said, steady and blunt. "You shouldn't be out here at this hour. This can wait, Arthur. There are notes. I need to know if a coastal packet left at the date on this letter." Dalton squinted and slid a folded paper toward Arthur. "Travel log S cross-indexed. UV the year." Arthur set the envelope aside and named the month. Dalton ran his finger down a column and then up, his finger tapping the paper like a small clock. There was a packet to the southern coast, left the 3rd week. A passenger manifest shows a myth. H traveling with a satchel. Leaves town that week, returned no more than a line. They marked him as absent after a year of no letters. Nothing stamped saying he forwarded or returned. The ledger offered a fact, not a reason. Arthur felt a shift then. Curiosity had tightened into suspicion. He folded the paper in his hands and left with Dalton's ledger rubbing the seam of his thigh. Rain had begun again when Arthur reached Market Lane and the boarded-up doorway of Mrs. Cartwright's lodging house. The sign hung crooked and its letters had flaked in places. He knocked, waited, and knocked again. A door cracked open and a woman with hair scraped into a tight knot stood inside, damp shawl hanging from her shoulders. "Mrs. Cartwright." "Arthur, I have questions about a man listed in a ledger, a Mr. A. He boarded here once." Mrs. Cartwright's mouth set. "Aye." "The man stayed a fortnight, paid in coins and asked for no receipts. He left in a hurry. I kept a brass ring he left under the floorboard. Took me a week to find it. Why are you asking?" Arthur placed his card on her palm and her fingers closed over the texture like that of a person recognizing a neighbor. "I found unopened letters tied in a ribbon. They were addressed to the same initial. I need to know if he left town or if someone took him. Any detail helps." She hesitated, then said, "He had damp boots, brown coat. He spoke of ships and time away. He left without his satchel once and came back for it the next morning. He paid a penny to the boy for a glimpse of a compass. He paid him twice to forget. That's all I remember, Mayor." Pembroke, that small last line, a payment to erase a witness, made Arthur's suspicion knuckle hard. He left with a detail that changed the shape of absence into something more deliberate. The ledger and Mrs. Cartwright's ring gave him routes to track and reasons to think there had been stops, exchanges, choices. Back under the lamplight of his desk at the archive, Arthur unfolded the final sealed envelope on the reading table and found a folded scrap tucked inside it. A thin piece of paper that had been tucked and not meant to appear with the other bundles. The scrap was creased and faintly scorched at one edge. Ink had bled across the fibers where moisture had sat once. The line in a quick hand read, "If you come, wait by the iron lamp at the quay at dusk. I will not miss you again. E. F." The 3 letters were small and unmistakable. Arthur felt a sudden shift from curiosity to a deeper unease. Eleanor's initials, E.F. Named a writer he had held in his hands before, a correspondent whose life he had only observed from a distance through envelopes. He realized the letters were not merely drafts or forgotten ramblings. They contained plans. Someone had planned a meeting that never happened. He replaced the scrap into the envelope and set it aside. He had to tell Eleanor. He locked the reading room, the click of the latch sharp in the near, silent building. The night felt taut with choices. He moved through the back corridors, carrying the envelope in a wallet pocket, aware of his finger brushing the thinness of the paper. Eleanor arrived at the archive before he expected her. She came by way of Market Lane, the hem of her dress damp, a faded shawl tucked over one shoulder. She paused in the lamplight and kept her gloved hands clasped. Under the lamplight her cheeks were pale, and the thin gold locket at her throat caught the light in a small, private flare. She did not run. She walked in steady, deliberate steps and seated herself at the table like a person who knew the rules of a room misser. "Pembroke," she said when he set the envelope on the table, "you have been busy." Arthur watched how she folded her hands and how her throat moved before she spoke. "Elena, I found another packet. There was a scrap inside this one that mentions a meeting at the quay. You wrote a plan and it is here between these pages." Eleanor's lips tightened. For a moment she said nothing. Her fingers found the thin worn quill she kept beside her, the same quill Arthur had seen ink smudges on before. "I remember writing it," she said finally. "I remember the lamp. I remember thinking if I folded the paper just so, I could carry him with me without carrying him into town." "What of it?" Arthur watched a change in her, from controlled reserve to a small flare of defense. The emotion in the room shifted. Eleanor's deliberate restraint moved into a guarded reproach. "You kept these sealed. Arthur, you kept them and you never sent them." "Why, Eleanor? Why bind them up and give them to the archive?" Her jaw pressed out to keep the possibility, to keep the chance of return whole. "You act as though I was hiding a crime." "I kept the letters because sending them would be admitting they belonged to someone else. Elena, you left a meeting note in one of them." The quay, the lamp. She slammed a palm on the table then, and the thin sound made Arthur start. "Do not make me elaborate a private choice for your catalogue," she said sharply. "Do not turn what I did into a thing to be understood by men who sought paper for a living. I kept them because I could not handle the reply being real and yet also gone. I cannot." She broke off and bit the inside of her cheek. Arthur leaned forward. "Eleanor, did he reply? Did Mir 8 ever reply?" Eleanor's eyes shifted and she looked away, and for the first time Arthur saw that the steadiness in her posture had worn threads. "I once burned a piece of paper," she said, "a reply. It was a short note, he would come if I waited. I burned it because I feared he'd change his mind if the reply existed in the world. I thought, better to have a future that is possible than a present that is certain and hollow. I burned it." Arthur felt the room tilt. He heard the crackle of something small being admitted into the air, a private action made public. The dialogue quickened between them. "You burned a reply. Arthur, you know that changes the record. You know that makes the archive a false witness." "I know, Elena, but I kept the rest so I could treasure what might have been. I thought of it as preservation, Arthur, not a lie. You kept it by choice. Arthur, the word choice like a small hammer, not by accident. People will read those letters as unsent because of carelessness, not because someone chose to protect an answer. Who are you protecting, Eleanor?" She stared at him. "Myself," she said quietly. They argued in short, clipped lines. Arthur pressed for facts. She offered them in a measured voice. "At one point, Eleanor, I didn't expect anyone to find them. I did not intend to make you an arbiter." Arthur's reaction tightened. He tapped his watch, a nervous habit drawn from years of measured routine. "I am an arbiter now," he said. "I keep records. I must decide what the public sees." Eleanor's hands turned the locket at her throat. "Then decide as you must," she said. "But know this. If you open every page, you will make a life into a public thing it did not consent to be. My letters are not a catalogue entry. They are part of a small life. The exchange was a collision of aims. Arthur's duty to preserve against Eleanor's insistence on private control. The argument resolved into a quieter negotiation. Arthur insisted the archive needed a factual record. Eleanor insisted certain pages remain closed. They both pressed into the meeting with hands like instruments. They reached an interim. Arthur would document dates, ink types, and travel references in the ledger, but would leave certain envelopes sealed to the public, accessible only to a small committee with the understanding that private choice was a consideration. That night they walked together a short distance to Elena's cottage. The rain washed the lane in silver. Inside her kitchen the hearth was low and a single kettle hissed on the stove. Eleanor produced a small scrap of paper and set it on the table with 2 hands. The edge of the scrap was blackened and curled, soot-smudged one side. Arthur leaned close and read the burned line she allowed him to see. He wrote, "If you wait, I will come. H." The revealed words slipped into the room like a small, private instrument. Arthur felt a new emotion arrive, understanding mixed with a reproach that was less about scandal and more about loss. Eleanor placed her palm flat on the table. "I received that note once. I burned it in the grate. I wanted to hold on to the possibility of him returning, not the messy fact of him staying away. I kept writing letters because writing kept the idea tidy. I kept them bound because sending would have fixed him in the world I cannot repair. That was my way of surviving the not arrival." Arthur looked at her hands. He saw the faint ink smudge on the right index finger she used for folding and the small scar near her left eyebrow. He saw a woman making choices that had consequences beyond her hearth. He had to decide whether to make those consequences public. They argued briefly, then in shorter lines. "Eleanor, who else knows Arthur?" "No one," she said, "only Mrs. Cartwright, and once, when I sent that note to the quay and waited, the boy from the boarding house saw me." Mrs. Cartwright came to the window and said nothing. I did not want them to call me inattentive. I wanted to save the memory of what might have been. Arthur paused and remembered Mrs. Cartwright's ring under the floorboard. The boy paid to forget a compass. Those details again. He felt the shape of a suppressed public, a ring, a ledger entry, a burned note. When the kettle's hiss subsided, they moved to the hearth. Eleanor produced the envelope Arthur had first shown her and opened it in his hands with a care that stopped the conversation into a contained ritual. She slid out the scrap with the plan to meet at the iron lamp. Her mouth tightened and she inhaled in a small, sharp way. "I did not send them because I could not bear the reply being real and empty at the same time," she said, "could not keep a returned letter and survive it being folded wrong in someone's pocket or lost in a carriage. To keep hope pure, I made it a thing in my own hands. I know that sounds foolish. I know it sounds selfish. But it is the truth." Arthur listened and felt the final shift, from reproach into a tempered compassion. He thought of the ledger entries he would write and of the committee that would decide public access. He thought of the archive's purpose to make lives legible, and how that purpose could also hurt the living who chose secrecy. The smallest twist came when Mrs. Cartwright arrived at the cottage in the rain with a small brass ring wrapped in newspaper. "I thought I should bring this back," she said simply. He left it here. I kept it because someone paid me to. I kept it until this morning because I thought perhaps he would return for it himself. Then the boy told me something about a sea passage, and I thought the ring should go home instead of gathering dust here." Eleanor's fingers closed around the ring like a person finding a missing button. She slid the circle onto her palm and turned it so the light from the hearth caught the brass. "Mr. Pembroke," Mrs. Cartwright added, "people come for their things in unusual ways. Sometimes they do not come at all. I am tired of holding tokens that remind me of the not arrival." The arrival of the ring shifted the story again. Absence took shape as a physical object that could be handed from one person to another. That transfer changed how Arthur recorded facts. He made notes in his ledger about the ring, the boarding house, the travel log, and Mrs. Cartwright's payment to a boy. He noted the burned scrap and the line about the iron lamp. Each notation rearranged suspicion into a detailed list of events. A mid-chapter twist arrived as Arthur compared the handwriting on the scrap with other envelopes. He found a marginal line he had not seen before, a quick, cramped postscript in Mr. H. his hand stating he had been delayed by a ship's cargo and would write again. The postscript suggested a delay, not abandonment. The postscript suggested human, avoidable impediments rather than fate. It made Arthur wonder whether the misalignment between a reply and a burned reply had been a choice or a mischance. For the first time, the unreplied to life looked less like desertion and more like a series of avoidable interruptions. When they returned to the archives in the grey light of early morning, Arthur's decision weighed on him. He placed careful entries into the ledger, dates, references to a coastal packet, Mrs. Cartwright's testimony, the ring, Eleanor's burned scrap, and the marginal postscript. He documented the facts he could verify and left a note about a sealed envelope set aside by agreement. His hand hesitated only once before he wrote. Sealed per request of writer. See committee. He set the pen down and tapped the table. He had made a choice. Eleanor watched him make the ledger entry. Will you include the burned scrap in the record? She asked. Arthur considered. He could preserve the existence of the scrap without reproducing its contents. He wrote a brief line about a charred postscript found and left the scrap in a small box marked for restricted access. This keeps the public ledger honest and leaves private choice intact, he said. After an hour of sorting and a short, quiet dinner at a table with 2 cups of tea, Arthur bound the bundle and returned it to its box. He set one envelope aside on the empty wooden chair by the hearth, as though leaving a single unsent thing in a place of warmth. He wrapped the rest and slid the box back into its shelf. The archive accepted the return with a slight complaint of wood on wood and a thin settling sound. Eleanor stepped back out into the rain, her shawl pulled up and the brass ring warm against her palm. She walked along Market Lane without urgency, the rain knitting tiny patterns on her skirt. Arthur watched her go from the doorway, then turned and set the single envelope carefully on the chair beside the hearth before closing the door. He left the reading room with the ledger in his satchel and a different sort of certainty. He had recorded the facts that could be verified. He had left closed what had been entrusted to privacy. He had confronted the choice between public knowledge and private preservation and chosen a compromise that kept both purposes visible. That morning the archive smelled of dust and wax. The lamp threw a low circle of light on the chair where the single envelope sat. Outside, the lane steamed with rain. Arthur tapped the face of his pocket watch and returned to his desk. He had fulfilled his duty to the record and honored, in part, Eleanor's choice to keep some pages closed. The ledger would list names, routes, and items. The ring would be catalogued. The burned scrap would be noted and filed for restricted review. The single envelope on the chair would remain for now, just that. An envelope waiting in a room warmed by a dying hearth. Eleanor crossed the lane and touched the brass ring once more, then slid it into the pocket of her worn coat. She did not rush. She kept her pace steady and went home into rain that had the honest smell of water on stone. Arthur returned to his desk and began the careful, mechanical work of entering facts into the log. He wrote each line with hands that had catalogued decades of other people's lives. He felt the weight of this small private thing and the consequences of making it a public record. The choice they had made that night altered 2 lives in small, specific ways. Eleanor kept the secret of the burned reply, and the ring returned from the boarding house. Mrs. Cartwright washed a cup and set the newspaper, wrapped brass into Eleanor's hands, and felt the relief of having returned a thing. Arthur kept the ledger honest and placed a note for restricted access. The archive would, in time, open its pages to historians and curious readers. For now, the sealed bundle lay under a lamp, and the single envelope sat on an empty chair by a hearth. The chapter closed on a concrete, final gesture. Arthur closed the archive's heavy outer door and, before he left, slid a plain envelope onto the chair beside the hearth. He did not write a note. He did not nail a name to it. He only set it there and turned the key. The sound of the key in the lock was small and decisive. Eleanor walked away into the rain with the brass ring in her pocket and a private act preserved under her coat. The ledger on Arthur's desk contained orderly columns and a single line marked with the words, "Restricted by request." They had answered one question and left another. Intentionally so. The ledger would inform a future reader of dates and objects. The sealed pages would hold the shape of a choice that belonged to the woman who had made it. The archive was a place of facts, but that morning it also bore witness to the quiet, deliberate work of keeping some answers between the living and themselves. Arthur shut the ledger, felt the weight of the closing, and walked home under a slate sky. The envelope on the chair stayed where he had left it, and the hearth kept its small, slow warmth for whoever might return to sit and decide whether to open it.